guys, this is Vaniac here from lifelikeyoumeanit.com, coming to you live today to talk about my new experiment that I am doing for surrender. So, if you've been following me, then you know that I actually have created several videos and even a couple of podcast episodes that are all about surrender. And I even have some meditations that I have done that I include in my 30-day challenge that are up on YouTube that is for surrendering. So I'm not new to the concept of surrender. But I realized recently through some life events and some repressed trauma that has come out in my body that I'm actually not surrendering as much as I thought I was in my life. So the videos and the podcast episodes and things when I talk about surrender on that level, I'm usually talking about surrendering the need to control other people, right? Their actions and reactions to things, their thoughts and opinions and beliefs, so that you can focus more on the things that you do have control over, which is yourself. You have control over what you think and how you act and how you react to things. Nobody else has control over you, and you don't have any control over anybody else, but you do have all of this control over yourself. But surrender for a large part, and for the last 40, well, no, not 40 years, the last 24 years or so of my life has been about trying to surrender to the flow of life, meaning that I'm very well aware of my ability to manifest the things that I want in life, and that when our thoughts start to drift into negative territory, that we start manifesting that as well, right? Not necessarily something that we actually want, but because we're focused on it and our predominant thoughts are of the negative, the universe mistakes that as what we want and presents that to us. So I've been a big believer in higher self and belief in the universe and belief in self for all of these years. And I have taken that to different levels, moving myself out of victimhood into empowerment. And there are four levels of consciousness, really. So there's victimhood, where we pretty much all sit at some point in our lives, regardless of how we were raised and our experiences that we've had. And the next level of consciousness, the next level of up would be empowerment. And the next level up is surrender. And the final level is awakening, or some would call it enlightenment. So I feel like the work that I have done with allowing myself to have that connection with my higher self and universal energy and the beliefs that I have around that, and following my gut instinct, having conversations with my higher self, and really allowing myself to flow with life up until this point in my life has really led me exactly where I am today, and has allowed me to move from victimhood into empowerment. And then about 3 weeks ago, something happened. And usually, for people to move out of empowerment into surrender, there is something that happens in their life to make them realize that they're not in full control here, that there is a higher power. Well, I've been living my life for 20 some years already believing in that power and trying to allow that power to manifest however it feels necessary. And just to give you a couple of examples of how I do this, when I was in Canada, I had a wellness center. I was a massage therapist. I had a wellness center with several other people that practiced lots of different modalities working with me. They were all contracted to work at that clinic. And we had an amazing wellness center. And after 5 years, all of a sudden I felt like I didn't want to renew the lease. And that made absolutely no sense. We were profitable, we were successful, we were happy, We had a beautiful building right on the lake. For any of my Canadian friends, family, and previous clients that are watching this, you know it was amazing. And yet I knew I needed to move on. I just didn't understand why. And I allowed that surrender to life. I allowed that understanding that life or universal energy or my higher self, whatever you want to call it or look at it, that it knew more than I knew in my consciousness in that moment. And that if I'm feeling this drive that I need to close it, then I have two options. I can sit and try to understand it and resist it until I do, and make a decision that, okay, now I understand it, and yes, it is worth it, or no, it's not worth. Or I can just allow myself to listen without the need of understanding. And that's what I did. And I shut down that clinic and I started working from my home. And within 3 weeks of that, my then husband and I separated. And I did not see that coming. There would have been no way for me to financially be able to afford to keep running that wellness center and actually find a place to live by myself with a mortgage, right? Yes, the wellness center was profitable, but it was also extremely expensive to run, right? The rent alone was thousands of dollars a month. And so I literally wouldn't have been able to afford that, but I didn't know that at the time that I felt like I needed to close that business. And within a couple of years, I found myself in university studying to be a teacher, which came out of left field. And when I finished that, I found myself accepting a job in England. Right? Again, I was in Canada. Again, I didn't understand why I had this drive to come to England. I rationalized it and thought that it was because I really wanted to go to Dubai. I really wanted this very exotic experience, and I needed to get some teaching hours under my belt, some real life practice experience under my belt in order to be able to get that amazing job in Dubai. And so that's how I brushed it off, and I really didn't think about it twice. And I found myself in England teaching, and I found myself devastatingly unhappy. I hated the school system here. I was having a very difficult time with really integrating and making friends. I was so homesick. And yet I just knew that it wasn't right to move back to Canada. And so I started applying for jobs in Dubai, but I didn't have enough experience yet. I was only teaching for a couple of months. And so, fast forward a couple more years, and I applied for jobs, and I got a job in Abu Dhabi, right next to Dubai, if you know the geography. And I didn't want to go. It didn't make sense for why I didn't want to go. This is what I had been striving for. I had been in England, I thought, to get the experience to go and move to the United Arab Emirates. I couldn't put my finger on it if it was because it was Abu Dhabi and not Dubai, and I had it set in my mind that it was Dubai. So that's how I rationalized it. And I turned down the offer, even though I didn't quite understand it, but I knew that it wasn't the right thing for me. And within a couple months, I met my now husband and stepsons. And as soon as I met them, I understood. I understood all of it. I understood why I needed to close the practice all those years earlier so that I could be working from my home and I could be spending less money on the cost of a big wellness center, and I could put those funds towards education. That education is what would bring me to England, and being in England would be how I would meet my husband. And it all came together. Now, at any of those times, I could have rationalized and used logic to talk my way out of any of them and not had any of those experiences. And I'm sure I would have built a lovely life, but luckily, I was able to realize that life knows more than I know on a conscious level, and trusted my gut and trusted myself to know that I would be okay no matter what happened. If it was a big flop, then it would be a good lesson. I could come back to Canada, for example, right? And it would be a great story to tell, and that I'd be strong enough to survive that and thrive through it. And the The same thing happened when I decided to give up teaching and start this business, right? It was very much going with the flow of life. I was very much surrendered to it. I had no idea how I was going to turn this into a business. I started by just writing a couple of blog posts, trying to highlight my experiences with not the abuse, not the negativity of the abuse, but all of the strategies that I used in order to become the person that I am today. And I remember working with a good friend of mine, Chris Atley, as my coach, because I felt like, as trying to look at this as a business, you're supposed to have a business plan. You're supposed to know where this is going to go. You're supposed to have these goals. And so I was working with Chris, who luckily is very spiritual as well, very much believes in energy and universal energy and higher self. And it was just quite funny because I really knew that I needed to just surrender to this and that life was going to show me how to turn this into a business, that I didn't need to work on it. And that's exactly what happened. And now I've got, this wonderful group. I've got all these different courses. I've met so many people through my podcast and through the NLP coaching and all the things that I do. I've written my book. There's been so many amazing things that have happened. And then 3 weeks ago happened. 3 weeks ago, I witnessed an attack against one of my pets. And because I believe in universal energy, I believe that I am connected to all things. And so my pets are sentient beings that I am attached to, I'm connected to. We are one, as I am one with everything else in the universe. And so witnessing that trauma, I think for anybody coming from my position would be a very difficult thing to see. I think anybody who has pets can relate on some level and it would be very difficult. But I'm also a survivor of 10 years of child abuse, violence that was part of my everyday existence. And witnessing that level of violence on something that I love and something that is vulnerable and couldn't fend for itself, who she is okay, by the way, she is alive, her wounds are healing, and she is doing very, very well. That whole witnessing of that brought out a repressed trauma from every facet of my being, trauma that I didn't even know I was holding on to. All the work that I have done in the last 20 some years on my progress and my healing has all been with my mind. And I never realized that I had been leaving out my body. In fact, I actually thought that I had considered my body through all of this because one of the first things that came up in my very early 20s was the fact that I was detached. My mental capacity and my physical capacity were detached from each other because to feel anything in my body, typically when I was a little child, meant I was feeling something terribly painful. And in those moments, those were life and death moments. So I didn't know how to compute discomfort that wasn't life or death. And one of my coping strategies as a little girl that had very little tools was to detach from that pain. And it worked very, very well. And I remained detached all through my teens until I reached my early 20s and realized I had this detachment. And I found that yoga was an incredible tool to be able to reattach. So much so that I've actually done a huge talk on it at a yoga show in London a couple of years back. And it was all about the fact that you're being allowed to feel my body during yoga and feel the discomfort of some of the poses, but have all of the control so that I could make the decision to ease off that pose or to stay with it or to even go further. That gave me so much empowerment, and it was a wonderful way to bring that attachment of mind and body back. And so I misunderstood myself at that time, and I thought that I had reunited my mind and my body, and that was that. And I went on with all of the work that I have done mentally, which has been a godsend, which has been amazing, which has allowed me to be the person that I am today. And so I'm very, very grateful for all of that work. And it's all the work that I help my own clients with, whether it's courses, my Survivor to Warrior program, the NLP sessions, whatever. So it's work that I very much believe in. But it also allowed me to neglect the fact that the trauma that my body was exposed to as a child was still there. And so those repressed traumatic memories came out 3 weeks ago. And they didn't come out in physical memories. In fact, I've had to actually sit and connect with these different parts of my body that are screaming out to me now to try to remember what the assault was on that area of my body so that I can have that connection, so that I can honor it and I can let it go. So it's not a mental thing that's popped up this time, it's a physical thing. And the very first thing that happened was, because this is coming in tremendous amounts of pain, physical pain, I couldn't function. I couldn't work. I couldn't sit down and do any lives. I couldn't sit down and plan any social media posts. I couldn't sit down and edit a podcast episode. I couldn't do anything for a solid week. Nothing but anti-inflammatories and very strong prescription pain medicine. And as that started to ease and I started to be able to function a little bit more and more without the medicine, I started to slowly integrate doing some things back with work. But I can't sit for long periods and focus for great lengths of time. And it's really allowed me to realize how much I am trying to control how I work, to control my business, this very business that was built out of surrender and allowing the universe to unfold and show me the paths, has now become me trying to tell the universe how I expect to help people and trying to manifest those things that I want because I think it's the right thing for my business. And along with this inability to actually work, with this physical pain that has taken me out, has come this book that one of my podcast guests a few months ago, Kelly, in her episode Step Out of Autopilot, I believe, she mentioned a book called The Surrender Experiment by Michael A. Singer. And I had not heard of this book, so I certainly hadn't read it. And I run a book club that's free, and so I decided this is going to be my next book club book. This will give me a reason to read it. And Kelly is, singing its praises, and I trust Kelly, so, this is great. It'll expose me to a new person and their ideas, and I'm all for that. I love learning from new people. And so literally just a couple of days before this trauma happened here in my home, I began to read The Surrender Experiment. And I began to have the first little niggles of how I wasn't surrendering as much as I thought I was in my life. And then the trauma happened, and the repressed trauma came out in my body, forcing me to stop. And that has caused me to reevaluate everything in my life and decide that I too am going to undergo a surrender experiment. So my surrender experiment might not be as vast as what some of your experiment, if you choose to join me on this, might be, because I have been surrendering and trusting my gut and looking at what life is giving me at many different parts of my life. But it will be a challenge for me because I am set in my ways, my strategies with business, my habits with business, and all these ideas that I have for different courses and workshops to develop in the future. And now comes a game of surrendering all of that and allowing the universe to present to me what it is I'm supposed to do next. And that might come with a thought. It might come like this book, reading this book. It might come from speaking to somebody who mentions something that I go, yes. It might come from literally somebody saying, Lisa, you should do this, right? It could come from my own experiences going through this physical repressed trauma and how I come out the other end of this. I don't know and I don't need to know. What I do know is that I am fully capable of surrendering, that the universe is fully capable of providing, and that if I allow life to flow, it will present me with exactly what it is I'm supposed to do in my next steps. Now, I'm specifically doing this with business. I invite you to join me on this experiment in any facet of your life or with your entire life. And really, what it is all of the things that happen to you in a day when things pop up. You know, this book, for example, when Kelly mentioned this book to me, it immediately went on a list that I have of books that I want to read. I immediately found it on Kindle and downloaded it. But then I had to make a decision to put it as a book club book because I know that I get so caught up in reading my book club books that I probably won't find the time to read it separately. But this was the first book club book that I was putting into the book club without reading it first. So I had to take a chance that it was going to be good. I had to take a chance that there would be some lessons there, that it would be worthwhile, not just to me, but to my audience, to the people that are members of the book club, that they would actually get something out of it. And I didn't know. So I could have decided, no, that's too risky. I'll read it first. And then maybe I never would have got to it because I'd be reading all of these other books that I have set for the book club, right? So life had presented it to me. And then I had to make a decision based on my own preferences. My own preference would certainly be to have read it first and make sure that I think that it resonates with me and the people in my book club, my audience, before I put it forward. But even before I read it, and even before I realized I wasn't surrendering as much as what I thought I was in my life, and particularly my business, it was just another one of those things that came up that I just knew that's what I needed to do. And so I trusted it and went with it. That is surrendering to the flow of life. These things are happening to us all the time. People mentioning things. You go into a bookstore, obviously not right now because of coronavirus, but you go into a bookstore, or maybe you're just going browsing through the shop in Amazon or Kindle, or when something pops up, you think, oh, that looks really interesting, right? There's these types of things that happen all the time in our conversations and in our interactions with other people and ourselves. And we tend to decide whether or not we're going to follow through with something based on our own preference, right? So all of the times when, for business, for example, that somebody has approached me and I've thought, no, that's not my expertise. There's somebody else that's much better suited for that, and send them over to that person. Or, no, this will take a huge amount of my time and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't think that this is actually a great use of my time. Maybe it's learning a new application or something like that. And so I've said, no, I'm going to stick with what I've got now, right? All of these types of things that are really just based on preference. They're not life or death. Nothing is going to, no lightning is not going to fall from the sky and strike me if I make this decision to do something that I don't really want to do. Of course, you've got to honor yourself and say, okay, I've bitten off more than I can chew here. But that still doesn't mean that you say no to the new thing that is coming up, but more that you look at your life and say, what needs to go? And that's what I'm doing right now with my business, right? Luckily, all of the people that I have done podcast interviews with, that I've interviewed for my podcast, have all been very understanding. I've had to contact a few of them to say your release date is just not going to happen. I'm not focusing on the podcast right now. I'm focusing on my own wellness and figuring out where the podcast comes into play in this new structure of my business. It will release. Because I have a promise to them. I feel like they were attracted to me during that time, and so those episodes will be released. But I don't know right now if I'll continue with the podcast. I don't need to know. And as soon as I start to think about whether or not I want to do the podcast, whether or not it's a useful way of me spending my time when I start to look at the stats of the podcast for how many followers it has, how many downloads it has against the amount of effort that needs to go in, how much money I'm making from it. As soon as I do those things, that's actually now the point where I say, wipe my hands of this. The flow of life will let me know if I'm to continue with this, not my logical brain that's going to tell me that, yes, I'm making so much money from doing the podcast, it's worth keeping. No. So it's no longer a judgment of how I see my income coming in versus my time expenditure going out. It's no longer these decisions that are going to actually rule how I work my business. It's going to be the flow of life introducing something to me. And when my first reaction is no, I will stop and actually ask myself, is this a personal preference? Are you saying no just out of personal preference? And if I realize I am, which 99.9% of the time is going to be the case, then I will do it. That I will put my personal preference aside and I will do it, knowing that life has brought it to my doorstep as a means for me to help somebody else, however that looks. And so that's already starting to happen with completely separate things from my business. I tutor secondary school science, for example. I used to be a science teacher. When I left to do this business, I started to tutor the odd student here and there. It started out with students that I actually taught at my school that were devastated that I was leaving. They liked my style of teaching, and their parents contacted me to say, do you think you could do some private tutoring for my child until they've graduated? Like, yes, absolutely. And that has now spawned into an entirely separate business. Right? Just because I have sat there and said, I'm in service to the universe. I'm going to stop judging how I help other people. I'm going to stop using a logical brain and saying, but I don't want to help people in tutoring. I want to help them in my Life Like You Mean It business. I'm going to allow the universe to show me who needs help and how they need help. And I'm going to listen. That's what surrendering to the flow of life is. So now, obviously, that is all a business example. I know a few of you have put in my little poll that I did that, yes, this sounds so interesting. I have no idea what it is. Tell me more. But I'm hoping that you can see how this can relate to personal aspects of your life as well. Allowing the flow of life to turn up, recognizing this might be an opportunity. My immediate reaction was based on a preference, and it's not going to hurt me to actually do this. So you know what? I'm going to actually put my personal preference aside and I'm going to do this, not with reluctance, not with resistance, not sitting there judging it, saying, I wish I was doing this instead. This is a waste of my time, but putting in a full effort to say, I am basically providing this as a gift to the universe. I don't know how it's going to play out. It may not play out to anything major at all, but it's been presented to me because it's something that I need to do for whatever reason. And just trust. That is surrendering to the flow of life. So I don't know how this is going to unfold. I don't know what this means for my business, even for this group. But for those of you that are in and you want to try this experiment yourself, I think that I will be coming in here live to share some different ways of doing this. I'm not actually sure, to be honest, right now, and I don't need to be. And that's really the brilliance of it. I'll do what I feel like I'm drawn to do, what presents itself to me. So feel free to ask your questions. Go on in. Kayla says, I like this. Oh, Kayla, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. So let me know your comments. Let me know your thoughts. If you've got questions on this, let me know what they are, because this will be one of the flows of life that helps me figure out how to help you. Bless.